Today we'll be starting Module 9 of Unit 3, which will be part of 3A testing. No is more central to today's psychology than the phrase, everything psychological is simultaneously biological. Everything from thought to emotion is a biological happening. For example, how does the brain organize and communicate with itself? Or how does the brain process information we need to perform some form of a task? So why are psychologists concerned with the human biology? Well, in the last century, we've come to understand that the body is composed of cells. Nerve cells talk to each other, that the brain specializes in functions that we perceive to make sense of experiences, and our brain adapts through those experiences. Now, most of the research done for this unit is done through the use of animals, as we talked about in Unit 2. So as we take a look at this unit, understand that we are going to look through the scope of the biopsychosocial approach, that the biological, psychological, and the social cultural systems all work together and interact. So let's start with how our information system handles all of our tasks. They do through billions of interconnected cells called neurons. This is the nerve cell that are basic building block of our nervous system. So we're going to now go through what is known as neuroanatomy, and that is a study of the different parts of the neuron and those functions of the nerves. So let's take a look at those parts of the neuron. As information we experience with our outside world, that information is taken in through what is called sensory neurons. They process information through what we call receptor cells. And then it is processed in what is called interneurons. And that is the neurons that are located in our brain and our spinal cord. And then they internally communicate back to our outside body through what are called motor neurons, which carry out information from the brain to the muscles and to the glands. So part of the neuron that contains the nucleus of the cell is called the cell body, or also referred to as soma. The dendrites are the bushy branches, the root-like cells that grow to make synaptic connections. They integrate messages, they conduct impulses towards the cell body. How is that information carried? It's carried through what is called the axon. Messages go away from the cell body to other neurons, and they are very selective about what it lets in, and that is referred to as selective permeability. Now, how fast does that information get carried out? It is carried out quickly as a result of what is known as called as the myelin sheath. And this is the fatty tissue layers that encases the axon. All right. So the myelin sheath helps communication because if it begins to degenerate, it slows down that communication, which leads to things like multiple sclerosis. I liken this to, let's say, a wire that a company plants in your yard for internet. Well, what protects that wiring that sends the communications from the box on the side of the house, let's say, to the inside of your house that's underground? It is a protective coating that they put around the wires. What happens if we cut into that or splice into that? it eliminates that communication to where it needs to go. So maybe that helps you understand what the role of the myelin sheath is. Okay. All right. The terminal branches are on the end of the axon. So as information goes from the cell body to the axon, they are then released into the terminal branches, which then connect to the next neuron and to take in that information. Glial cells, or also known as glial cells, support and nourish and protect those neurons, which, as I said before, help insulate the myelin sheath. And so the glial cells or the glial cells are what are important to allowing that connection to speedily go through the neurons. So how's the neural impulse generated? This is stimulated by a transmission known as action potential. Neurons are like batteries. They generate electricity from chemical events. And so when one neuron fires, the axon security parameters change. And we're going to talk about that here in a second. So what happens is these chemical signals exceed a minimal threshold, and those neurons fire, and it transmits electric impulses, which we call action potential, down the axon. And this is a series of, let's say, barriers that open doors until it leads to the axon terminals. So here is a slide that gives you a little better understanding of what happens with the threshold. As you can see, as it increases, the action potential occurs, which then opens the door for the neurotransmitters to build up and then flow through. So there are two types of impulses. They can be excitatory or inhibitory. An excitatory signal is like when you press on the gas pedal, the car goes. An inhibitory signal is when you press on the brake and then it stops that neurotransmitter from transmitting. So after the action potential occurs, outside the axon membrane, you find mostly positive charged sodium ions, and in the interior contains negatively charged proteins and a small amount of positively charged potassium. This creates a negative charge, and at this point, the neuron is said to be in a resting state or polarized. So those exchanges of ions, those electrically charged atoms, is what actually allows action potential to, or in that message, to be sent down the axon. And so when it's changed, it goes to that resting state, which stops that transmission. Within a vast majority of nervous system, multiple neurons connect with each other, creating a complex neural network capable of almost endless combination of neurons communicating. So how does this work? What are the steps? All right. So the first section of the semi-permeable axon opens its gates once the threshold is met. And we've already talked about how that threshold occurs. Those Na positive ions flood through the channel. So that's opening up a door. It's like a floodgate that opens. Once they're inside, those negative ions try to balance the charge, causing a slight, what is called a depolarization. The next step is it changes that electrical charge, and the gates are now in the second area are now open to allow those neurons to keep going. So this is a series, if you will. If you would think of a floodgate, you open one door, the water flows, then those doors shut. The next compartment, the doors are shut. So those ions keep changing, which opens those doors all the way through the axon until it ends up into axon terminals. All right, so I'm going to move on down as they continue to repolarize until they end up depolarizing and repolarizing till it ends up getting to the axon terminal. Now, what happens when the action potential at the end of the neuron? This is what we call a resting pause, or what is called a refractory period. It gives it time to relax, and you need enough energy to restart that fire again. So it's a build-up period. So here are some key terms. You have polarization, depolarization, and repolarization, which is the refractory period. So these are terms that you'll want to be familiar with. So how do they communicate with each other? They send neurons to neurons release what are called neurotransmitters across what is called the synaptic gap. So as you can see, one neuron is sending the action potential down the line to the terminals, which meets with the next neuron, which is called the synapse, and the next neuron receives into the cell body that chemical reaction. And it continues all the way to the brain and then back through the motor neurons to the rest of the body to communicate. And this is how that occurs. So those chemical messages travel through the synaptic gap, and then they are passed on. Not all of those chemicals are passed on. Some are sent back into the previous neuron, which is called reuptake. This is a slide that shows you and tells you a little bit about the synapse. So a transmitter is reabsorbed by the sending neuron. This is what I said was the reuptake. Now we'll talk more about this when we get to drugs and all those kind of things and how they affect our body and how they stop the transmission or they encourage the transmission. So when action potential reaches the terminals, the axon, it triggers a release of chemicals. And that's what those neurotransmitters are. That meeting is called neurocommunication. Here is a list of neurotransmitters that influence our baby. What are their functions and what are their malfunctions? And you'll come to understand how this information is important as we move into the brain. This will end Mod 9's lecture. If you have any questions, we'll talk about it tomorrow.